I never know what tomorrow will bring, or what new person I will go home with, or what new place I'll be sleeping at tonight. But it's all right. My heart's come back up off the ground. And although I'm not happy, I am more contented. Do you it? Slantiaga Silkugat.
Maggie, none of that Irish tongue of yours. Speak the good mother tongue of England.
Yes, sir. It's not any tongue of my mother.
Maggie.
I'm not saying, sir, I'm just telling her that. Well, my name is Maggie, and that you know. And sure, I'm indentured to the master there, and that you know too. And sure, I'm from Ireland. And if you can't tell that by now, you've no more sense than a rabbit.
Maggie!
I'm not saying, sir, I'm just telling her that. Well, I am from Ireland, born and bred there, raised till I got married to a man named Robert Delaney. My Robbie was a good man, a fine man, a man that took pride in the work of his hands and in everything he did, so he never stood ashamed before any living soul. Now, Robbie was a farmer, a tenant farmer, and sure, and I farmed the land with him, and it was hard work in them days. 'Tis when you get your living from the ground, hon iron man and beast. But isn't it true that the back must slave to feed the belly? And though our days were long and hard, and I'm sure you know of those, still there were the better times too, when we'd sit before the peat fire in that little stone hut and have the sweetness of it between us because of it. Now, we didn't own the land we worked. Sure, none of us did in Ireland. It's all owned by the great lords, you see, and we have to pay a rent and a tithe in order to be able to live on it. We didn't have much left after the paying, but we had what we needed in most years. Food to put on the table, and a roof over our head, and enough to keep the wolf away from the door, and that's what anyone needs to be contented, is it not? Children? Sure. 7 children I bore to Robbie in the years we were there together. But 4 of them rested in the ground together, and only 3 were left alive to us. Our oldest was Colin. He was about 10 summers old, with a hair of wild thatch, and a twinkle in his eye, and a dimple in his chin just there, like his pa had. And then Brenna. Oh, she was our golden child. Hair the colour of a sunset, eyes the colour of a summer sky, and had a smile what would bring the very sun up in the morning. And oh, she was her father's pride and joy. And then there was the babe, Colleen. And although she was only a season old, she was already the joy and the laughter of our lives. We were happy there and contented, and had no thought of ever leaving it, especially to be coming here to the colonies. But you know, they say that the most sudden changes take place on the most unlikely of days. And isn't it true that it's only the good Lord himself who knows the twist and lay of the road in front of us? Now, Ireland is a poor country, made poorer still by England having her fingers in everything we do to keep us that way. But there come about a time that there was a crying out from the colonies for the good Irish linen. Sure, you know what I'm talking about, don't you? It's the finest in the world. And there was a coin to be made, because England already had hers and didn't care about it. And it started in the towns at first, and then it began to grow out into the countryside. And when it did, it began to drive the leases and the rents up. Rack rents, they called them. Sometimes 2, sometimes 3 times as much as what the poor farmers had ever paid. And when it did that, it began to drive the farmers off. And so it did us. I remember well the day that they brought the new lease to us to sign. And the price they asked more than twice what we'd ever paid before. More than the land itself could produce. And poor Robbie tried to argue with him, but what do you say when you don't own your own land? And when we said we couldn't pay it, sure weren't they all in a grand hurry for us to get out, and they stood about in the yard that day and by the doorway while we gathered everything we could and carried it to the road. And then they burned our house behind us so we wouldn't go back to it. And as I stood in the road that day with my things scattered about me and my children clutching at my skirts, sure and didn't I know what would happen to us, because wasn't that the only life we'd ever known? Well, I'll not tell you all the days that followed. What with us walking and selling everything we brought with us in order to be able to buy food, and Robbie trying to find work or another land to lease which wasn't to be had, and we did that till we came to the town of Strabane, and there we stopped. For you see, we'd sold everything we could bring with us, and the food was almost gone, and the children weary and weeping, and no place to lay our heads. And in the morning, Robbie and Colin would get up and go into town, and they'd try to find work to earn coin to buy bread for one more day. And I would take Brenna and the baby and go door to door and beg for a crust of bread, a bowl of milk, just anything to feed the children one more day. But the people there were poor as we were, and they had little enough to spare. And so there was more than one night that the children had nothing but their tears to take them to sleep and fill those empty bellies. Oh, Robbie and I didn't know what we were going to do. We were at the end of ourselves. And then that day comes, when he comes back from town early one day. And oh, he's all in a grand way. You see, he's found a man, he says, a man who's an agent for a ship that's docked at Derry. It's going to the colonies and it's taking on passengers. And they'll take us too and give us food besides, if we'll just make a mark on the paper, you see, that says we work for 4 years to pay off the passage. Work for 4 years, I says to him. And then what? Why, Maggie, says he, we'll be free. Ho, says I, free will we? Free to do what? To starve like we're starving over here? No, Robbie, we'll stay here in Ireland and do that. Nil, Maggie, he says, it's not like that. You see, over there the land is free. It's free, Maggie. And when we get free, we'll go get some of that land and make a place and a home that no one can ever take away from us again. Now, my mother always says I have a Thomas kind of mind. And sure, I am full of doubts. And so I says to him, free land. Free land indeed. Robert Delaney, who's gone and put this stuff and nonsense in your head. No one gives land away for free. Nil, Maggie, he says, is truth and for certain. The ship's man told me all about it, and he's the look on his face of a good and honest man. Oh, does he now, says I. Well, there's often the look of an angel on the devil himself.
Maggie.
I'm not saying, sir, I'm just telling her that.
Let's not be unkind.
No, Robbie, I says to him, no. I've no wish to take my children and cross the ocean to another land. I don't want to be anyone's property for 4 years. We'll stay here in Ireland. You'll find another land to lease or a job. We've got to have hope. I never forget what he says to me that day. For don't he lean over and look me dead in the eye. And he says, Maggie, there's hope from the ocean, but there's none from the grave. And I look down at the faces of my children standing there all hollow-eyed and quiet and listening. And I see how their little faces are pinched and drawn with hunger. And I bowed my head. For sure, didn't we have to take whatever fate was holding out in her hands to us, whether I wanted to go or no? So back into town we went that very day, to the ship's man, who took us straight to the magistrate, and there they drew up the indenture papers, one for Robbie, one for myself. and one for each of the 2 older children, which I thought rather strange. But at 6 and 10, they could do a fair amount of work, and in 4 years, they'd be able to do that much more. Have you ever seen indenture papers? Nah. Well, you see, they took a piece of paper about this big, and they wrote on it a contract, a promise between us and the captain of the ship, once at the top and the same again at the bottom. And then everyone signed it. The ship's man signed it at the top and bottom for the captain, and the magistrate marked it with a red seal. That's what made it legal. And then they made a mark on the side for us to make our mark in. Sure, none of us could read or write. And then they took that and they cut it in half so that the master always has one half and we have the other half. But they didn't cut it straight across. They cut it in and out like this, so that when you pulled it apart, it fit back together again like big teeth, like a puzzle. And you see, it was indented. That's why they called it an indenture paper. Well, the ship's man took his and put them away, and he folded up the others and handed them to Robbie, and he says, "Now here, Mr. Delaney, you take a hold of these and hang on to them, for they're important." Didn't I know they were important? Didn't I know when I made my mark on that paper I'd sign myself away from Ireland forever? I knew we'd never be back again. And then we followed the ship's man out the door and back into the street again. But it was different. You see, when we came in that door, we were our own masters, and no one owned us but God. But when we walked back out that door, we were nothing but the property that belonged to another man. And that was a bitter, bitter moment. But the bitterness was made better by the ship's man doing as he promised. He gave us food and victuals enough to see for several days. And he told us to go to Derry, there to the docks, and the ship that we would find, and the day that we needed to be there, and the day that she would sail. And so we left the next morning to walk to Derry. For sure we had no reason to stay there anymore. And after walking many days, we finally came there to Derry, and we went straight to the docks, and went straight to the ship, and there she was, the Sally she was called. Oh, what a grand ship she was. And the sailors climbing up and down her, and calling back and forth to one another, carrying all manners of goods to carry to the colonies. There was people there too, fine people. People that had paid a coin, you see. They were going to ride on top of the ship, sail over there to start a new life, to find fame or fortune. But there was people like us there too. People that were driven out and starving and made a mark on a paper in order to be able to find hope. Well, we showed our papers to the sailors who took us on board the ship. And they pointed down the ladder that went into the hold and said, "Now get down there with the other indentures and don't come back up again." And so we did. We went down the ladder into that darkness and misery that we would be in for the next several weeks. Have you ever been down in a hold like that? Nil, you're fine. Well, let me tell you what it was like for those of us that were down there, under the feet of them that was paying to go across. You see, the hold was a room down in the belly of that ship. Oh, about as long as 8 tall men laid head to head. And maybe as wide as 2. But it's only this tall, so that you can't stand up in it. You've always got to be down on your hands and knees, or sitting or lying, or whatever you can do, whatever little space you've got. Because there's 100 of us in there by the time we sail. Mostly men, but some women and children, whatever little things they brought with them. There's no portholes for light down there. The only light we have comes from the ladder that goes up to the deck, but we're never allowed to go up there. No, you see, they're afraid that we'll mutiny and take over the ship, or throw ourselves overboard in the misery that we're in. Every day we were given a bowl of gruel or porridge, some stale ship's biscuits, maybe a handful of dried peas, sometimes a piece of meat, a pint and a half of water. The children got half of that. The baby got none at all. And down at the end of that room where the ladder came down, at the bottom of the ladder they put 2 buckets. That was for our waste, for 100 people. And they emptied them once a day. So you can imagine it doesn't take very long for what's in those buckets to be able and begin to wash over the sides and mix with the swill of the water that you're sitting in. And as it moves across the floor where you are, it brought with it sickness and disease and then death. And before we'd even been at sea more than a fortnight, the very old and the very young began to die. And among them our own little Colleen. Well, too well did I know that my milk had dried up, and the food that they gave us, the gruel and the porridge, had no strength in it for a babe, and so when the fever came on her in the night, she had neither the strength or will to fight it. She died in my arms there the third day. And that was a grievous thing. But more grievous it was to me when the sailors came down and took her little body from me and carried it up to the deck of the ship and threw it over the side and into the water for a grave. You see, she didn't rest cradled in the arms of our homeland there with her brothers and sisters, but was lost and alone out in the middle of the wildness of that sea. But she wasn't the only one that died. Pity more it was the mothers who brought their little ones on board, with their little ones still inside them, and whose time came on them while we were still traveling. Not one baby survived that burden, and all of the mothers but one joined their little ones in that graveyard of a sea. I tell you, that was such a time of misery and heartache. Sitting down there in that blackness and darkness, with the air so hot and stale that you can't breathe it, and when you do, you taste death on your tongue. Down there in that blackness where your hopes, your dreams, your fears, your very soul dies. And you care not for the day or the night, and you listen to the sound of the rats crawling and chewing on dead alive alike. Everything in you dies. And you just sit there and you wait for the end to come, no matter how or when it does. But at last the end did come, and the shout went out that land had been sighted. And in a few days we sailed up the river and into the port of Philadelphia, and there we stopped. And the captain put up notices for all the indentures that he had for sale, and they brought us up from below the deck and tore off our filthiness that we were wearing and poured water on us and scrubbed us with the hard brushes. And then they gave us old clothes to wear so we'd look better for the buyers. And the buyers came on, and they'd come by you and feel your muscles or open your mouth and look at your teeth. Sometimes they'd make you step out and walk back and forth as though you were a cow or a horse in the marketplace. Now there were those that came on and asked, do you know a skill or a trade? Can you read or cipher? And the ones that could, sometimes it went better for those, but not for all. Robbie and I were bought by a man called a soul driver. A soul driver, you see, is a man that comes on board the ship to buy a group or a lot, to take out into the villages and to sell, make a profit over the 12 or 15 pounds that he's paid for you on the ship. We'd never given any thought but that our whole family would be sold together. For sure, that's what we'd been told, but that was not true. You see, our Colin and Brenna, the only two children left alive to us, were each bought by a different man and taken away and off the ship. And I tell you, it's a hard thing as a mother to sit there and listen to your children be calling to you, and you not knowing where they're going or what will happen to them or if you'll ever see them again. And I can still hear in my mind the sobbing of the women and the crying of the children as they're being taken away, and some of them having to be carried away that are that young. And the youngest of them at all, the little ones, they took them and handed them over the side of the ship as though they were unwanted puppies to anyone that would take them. I've not seen Colin and Brenna since that day, nor am I likely to. For didn't we find on that day that the papers that the children marked didn't hold them for 4 years like ours, but hold them till they're 21. And at 6 and 10, I'm likely never to see them again. I don't know where they are. I don't know if they're alive or dead. But the good Lord knows. And sure, and it's in his hands I had to place them because my arms weren't big enough to hold them anymore. Well, those of us that had been bought by the soul driver, were herded together like a bunch of sheep, and off the ship and through the town. South, I thought we went. In every little town and every little village we came to, we would stop. And this word would go out that there were indentures for sale, and we would wait for a day, and sometimes 2, while the men came in, and sometimes the women, and looked us over. Now, Robbie was bought in one of the first places we stopped. But not me. And there wasn't time for us to talk to one another, or to say anything, or to touch in any way, which we wouldn't have done in front of strangers, but there was only time to look at one another. And in my eyes, I know there was anguish. But in Robbie's eyes, there was a calmness, a peace, and a promise. And then as they began to take him away, and my eyes followed him for as long as I could, right before he went out of my sight, he turned and looked at me one more time. And he gave me that devil grin he's got. And he nodded his head. And I know what he was telling me. Oh, I know. You see, he was saying, "Oak to hail, Maggie, oak to hail." Courage. Courage, Maggie, we'll be together again. Then he was gone. And I was alone. And I tell you, I could have laid down in the road right at that moment and died. Oh, how I wished I'd never listened to that man. We would still be in Ireland, and I would have my children and my husband by my side, but now here I am in a strange land full of strangers and no one to call my own. But as the days went by, the parting grew easier to bear. And I began to look ahead to the days when we would be together and finding our own place and making that home that we promised that we would do. Well, I myself was bought more than a fortnight later by a man who was also looking for workers for the field. And I don't think he was very happy at having to buy an Irish woman. But that's too bad. I was one of the best that was left, and so that's what he got. My papers were signed, and I had my first master. Now, my new master was a gentleman farmer. He seemed to have a great deal of wealth. He wore fine clothes, wore a grand blood horse, had a carriage, and a house full of beautiful, beautiful things. Of course, I didn't get to see those till the very end, but I knew they were there. Now, I don't call him a generous man, nor will I call him a kindly man, but I will call him a fair man. For sure, and he wasn't hard or cruel or unjust in any way, as long as you did the work he asked of you and in the time he asked you to do it in. But he had a fine kind of wife that thought too much of herself that was proper, and had a tongue so sharp it could clip a hedge.
Maggie!
I'm not saying, sir, I'm just telling her that. Well, she was a harsh and cruel woman, more than made up for the fairness of her husband. Nothing was ever right that was ever done for her. And don't I see her little housemaids many times with their cheeks all red, where she'd slapped them for not doing her hair right, or not doing the tea right, or a thousand other things. Oh, she had not mercy or kind words for any of us, whether we were in the house or the field, and all of us kept out of her way as to stay out of the way of that tongue. Oh, she was a hateful woman, vain and proud, proud as a whitewashed pig.
Maggie,
I'm not saying, sir, I'm just telling her that. Well, glad I wasn't put in the house with her. But I spent my days and went to the fields as I'd done many days in Ireland, going up and down the rows doing different things. But you see, I found it was different. I couldn't take a rest if I was tired. I couldn't get a drink of water if I was thirsty, not unless an overseer told me I could go. I found that quick enough. I hadn't just signed my labor away in those papers. I signed my very body and soul away to someone instead. Here it was, we worked 6 days a week from the time the sun rose in the morning till it went down at night. No day off except the Sabbath, and on that day we had to work in the garden to grow our own food. Every night we would put together in 2 large sheds to sleep, one for the men and one for the women. That was to stay any temptation away from us. Wasn't that like trying to net fish with a ladder? I'm not saying, sir, I'm just telling them that. There were those among us that were lazy and idle, and they spent more of their time trying to get out of the work than putting into the work they were doing. And I wondered at that. But it didn't take me very long to find out who they were. They were His Majesty's 7-year passengers. You know what I'm speaking of? No. Oh, let me tell you. Sure, they were the filth and the scum from the prisons in London, sent over by His Majesty himself. You see, so he didn't have the feed and care of them anymore. Oh, there were pickpockets, rogues, debtors, and among the women, strumpets no less, who brought their work and their foul diseases right along with them. Oh, they were a rough group to be sure, and each and every one of them was suffering from a double dose of original sin.
Maggie!
I'm not saying, sir, I'm just telling them that.
Get on with it now.
Well, all that poor, sorry group did was talk about trying to get back to England again. And faith, didn't even I know what would happen to them if they made it all the way back. You see, once you're transported by the king, if you escape and make it back to England and get caught a second time, well, there's no mercy for you this time. No, you'd be taking a trot on the 3-legged mare.
Explain that, Maggie.
You'd get hung. But that didn't stop them from running away. And shoo, every now and then one would go running off, and oh, what a hubbub there would be. The master would be taking out ads in the Gazette and sending out hunting parties, and the mistress would be scolding and worse than usual. Sometimes they were caught, and when they were brought back, they'd hang them from the whipping pole and thrash them for all of us to see, so we'd learn a lesson from it. The magistrate would be called. Their papers would be added years onto them, not just for the time they'd been gone, but for whatever money the master had to spend to get them back again. But they weren't always caught, and we didn't know if they were alive or dead. But I heard blood-curdling tales from the tongues that would wag around the fire of a night. And they'd tell stories of what masters did to other servants, the things that they could do, the ways that they could whip you, and even kill you if they wanted to, no matter what the law said. Because sure and don't we know that our lives are now in the hands of a master, no matter what anyone else has to say about it. They were probably just stories. Now, for 3 years I was there at that place. 3 years I spent there, almost, doing nothing but getting a bowl of gruel and having a place to sleep for the work that I was doing. But there at the end of that 3rd year, the master got sick, and a grand sickness it was. And the doctors came and went, but they could do nothing for him, and at last he died. And after that, just a day or 2 later, there came from the town wealthy men and merchants from the town to talk to the mistress. And when they left again that afternoon, we could hear her weeping and wailing all the way out to the sheds, and we wondered at that. Now in Ireland, we have a saying, dead men tell no tales. But there's plenty you can learn in the wake house. And the talk that came out of it was this, that our master had lived a fine and wealthy life, to be sure, but he'd lived it on the money of other men. And now he was dead and gone, and those men were here to collect what they were owed, and there was none to be had. And so they told us that everything would have to be sold in the days to come in order to pay his debt off. Now, that was a hard thing and a fearful time. 'Cause sure, our life had been hard, but the master had been fair for the most part. But now you face a selling block and a new master, and who knew where you would go or what would happen to you? I'd heard those stories. Well, the day finally come, and oh, what a crowd there was. All the friends and neighbors and the people from miles around just to see. And they sold us first, and then set us to the side to be held by overseers, till our new masters came to get us. And then they sold all the things of the farm. And then they began to carry the things out of the house. That's when I finally got to see all the fine things. And I look over there at the widow, and she's standing there, wringing her hands and crying with her children clutched at her skirts. And I'm thinking to myself, well, what's that poor woman to do tonight? She'll not have a bed to rest on or a lamp to light. And I thought she was crying because all her fine things were going. But that wasn't it. For what do you think they did when they sold all the things that could be sold and there was money still to be paid? But take that woman's children one by one and put them on the block and sell them as indentured servants. Yeah. And no amount of crying by that woman or sobbing by those children stopped them from being sold till they were 21. Didn't that bring back the hard memories of my own child being sold away? And I look over there at the mistress, and she's standing there, wringing her hands in her apron and crying for all she's worth, and the tears rolling down her face. And for a moment I felt a small stir of pity in my heart. But it passed quick enough, because I didn't care for the woman one whit.
Maggie!
I'm not saying, sir, I'm just telling her that. Well, with that, I thought that it was all over, and I was looking to see my new master coming to take me away. But before I could even get that thought out of my head, the men who were owed the money went over to talk to the mistress. And the next thing you know, they've got her by the arms, and they're pulling her to the block, and she's crying out, "No, no, no!" You know what it was? There was still money that was owed, and the only thing left to sell was her. Oh, how we all laughed at that. And I know them little house servants that were behind me was right glad to see her put up in their place. And as they put her up on the block with her screaming and yelling. And I'm thinking to myself, well now, it won't be so hoity-toity for you anymore, will it, missy? And I was glad she was being sold.
Maggie!
God's true, sir, I'm not just saying this time, and I hope she got a mean master.
Maggie, you hold your tongue or I'll give you Sunday's sermon twice more.
I've already heard it twice, sir.
Maggie?
Yes, sir.
Get on with it.
Well, when they put her up on the block, a man in the crowd called out, "How many years? How many years do you sell the woman for?" And the man that was holding her by the arm said, "Sir, we can sell her for up to 39 years to cover what her husband owed in debt." Well, when he said that, she closed her mouth and quit her wailing and weeping. And when she opened it up again, the words that fell out, no fine lady ought to know. Whoo! Vulgar talk, street language, language that no lady ought to know. Shocked us all into silence, all of us, and all of her friends and neighbors. Till the strumpets behind me began to snicker and laugh. And then they whispered, and the talk came all the way around and back to me. And you know what it was? That whether or not he'd known it, that master had married one of them strumpets off the streets of London, the ones that were sent over here by the king himself to be wives for the planters. Made her out to be a fine lady, and here she was no better than the rest of us. Wow, I laughed at that. And I look out, and there's all her friends and neighbors standing there with their eyes all open and their mouths hanging open like a bunch of dumb sheep. And I wanted to say to each and every one of them, what do you expect from a pig but a grunt?
Maggie!
I'm not saying, sir, I'm just telling them. Well, those of us that had been bought together were tied by the neck and led out into the road by 3 overseers, the master having gone on his way, you know. We thought that boded no goodwill, and we weren't allowed to talk to each other, so we didn't know where we were going. But one of the pretty young things that was with us made up to the overseers, and before nightfall we all knew where we were going. You see, we'd been bought by a man who lived about a day and a half away, had a large plantation. Now, I might not tell you all about that place, because sure, it's a hard talk to be able to tell, and I don't want to make you sad. But I will tell you that what I thought had been a hardship the 3 years before was nothing but a gentle journey compared to where I went now. Because here it was the master himself never came to the field, but left us in the hands of his overseers, who were themselves cruel and hard men. Here we worked 7 days a week, till when the sun came up in the morning till long after it went to bed at night. No place to sleep except for the hard ground, and many a night you just lay down where you were because you were too tired to find another place. Here it was I saw cruelty done man to man that I'd never seen before. Here it was that I saw men and women alike lashed to death for what they were doing. I saw them crushed under the loads they were asked to be borne because they were too weak to carry them. Here it was that some crawled off into the woods and took their lives into their own hands to get out of the misery they were in. And some of them tried running away, but they were almost always caught. And when they were brought back and hung from the whipping post for us all to see, stripped down and beaten till the back of their neck to the soles of their feet looked like nothing but a piece of bloody meat. I began to be afraid that I would never live to see Robbie out. I would never make that last year to see him again. But I'd not been there very long, till there come a day. There was another servant working next to me that I didn't know. And as we worked side by side, don't I feel his eyes on me all day long, back and forth and back and forth. It made me nervous, I tell you, because sure, and I wasn't used to being watched like that. But finally he gets up close enough to whisper over to me, "Maggie Delaney, don't you know me?" And ooh, what a start I had. Because you see, I'd not heard my name put together like that since leaving the ship. And I look at him, and as I do, don't the dawning come. Sure, and he's one of the young men that's been with us on the ship from Ireland, down in that dark hole together. And glad I was to see him, and I nodded at him to let him know that I knew who he was. And as we kept working along, I'm thinking to my mind that he was sold with Robbie at that first place that we came to. And so I asked him, quiet like, "My Robbie, do you know of him?" And he nodded his head. And oh, what gladness it was. And I thought my heart would jump clean out of my chest for joy. And so I asked him again, quiet, "Do you know where he is?" And he said, "Sure, and I do." But before my heart could take a leap that second time, he added, "More's the pity. Your Robbie's been dead and gone these 2 years together." I thought I didn't hear him right. And don't I get angry at him, and I say to him, No, it's Robert Delaney I'm speaking of. You're thinking of another." "Neil, Maggie," he says, "sure, and it's your Robbie I'm speaking of. I was with him at that place when he caught the fever. I helped to bury him myself. God rest his soul." Sure, and I thought I took a blow in the chest. And wasn't it my heart that fell out on the ground that day? And then I went deaf and dumb to the whole world, and everything began to spin around and around, and then my legs wouldn't hold me anymore, and I fell to the ground, wild with my weeping. And as I lay there on the ground, I thought to myself, no, Robbie can't be dead. No, we only had this much more time, and we'd be finding our own place and making a home. I don't know how long I lay there on the ground. Long enough for an overseer to see me, and the first I knew of that man was the blow I took across my back. And then him pulling me to my feet and shouting in my face, and I know that he wanted me to keep working. But I ask you, how could I? How could I? Robbie was dead and gone, and what did I have left to live for? Everything I had, everything I knew was gone and taken from me now. What future did I have left? I don't remember all the days that followed, with me trying to do my work, my eyes red and swollen from my weeping, and every step I take, in my head the voice is pounding. You're alone. You've no husband, you've no children, you've nothing, Maggie, you're alone. I don't know how many days that went on, But finally one day there come an answer back from right here that said, yeah, you've no husband. You've no children. You've nothing here of your own, but you do still have a home. And home is where you need to be, back to Ireland where you belong. And the more I thought on that, the more the desire in my heart grew to go home. And one night when I laid myself down to sleep, my feet just picked me back up again and I ran away. Oh, I was caught right away and brought back and beaten. But as soon as I could, I ran away a second time. Caught right away, brought back and beaten. But when I healed enough from that, I ran away a third time. But this time, you see, I knew where I was going. I wasn't just running willy-nilly out there, anywhere I could go. I was going to find the ocean. And in the ocean, I'd find a port. And in the port, a ship that's going back to Ireland. And I'd do whatever I had to do to get on that ship. Because I was going home. Wasn't that like trying to send a goose on a mission to the fox's den? Oh, what a fool I was. To think I knew where I was. I didn't even know where I was. I didn't know where the ocean was. What a fool I thought, that I could get out into road and trail and find my way without getting caught. And caught I was again the third time. But I made many, many days this time before I got caught that third time. I was taken into the little town there and turned over to the magistrate, who had me thrown in the jail while they went to see if they could find out who I belonged to. And as I sat there in the jail that time, I thought to myself, Maggie, you're such a fool. You're not ever going home. And your life has no more worth to it. And you've got nothing. And so I decided that when I was taken back and beaten in the way I knew I would be this time, that I'd find a way to crawl off and end my life too. But as you can see, that's not quite what happened, because here I stand. You see, what happened is when the master sent back my papers to the magistrate and told him that he wanted no more to do with an Irish widow who was grieving and couldn't do a day's work and had now run away for the third time. So he said, give her whatever punishment you think she deserves and sell her for whatever you can get and send it back to me. And that's what he did. The first thing he did, the magistrate did, was take my papers. Now, I ran away once. I'd gotten 2 extra years for that. And when I ran away the second time, 2 more for that one. And now he saw the length of time I'd been gone this time and the money it had taken to get me back again. And he wrote 6 years. So now I have 10 years plus my 1 to finish instead of what I had before. And then he took me out and had me whipped at the public pole. 40 lashes less 1. That's what the good Lord took, and that's the same you could give to me. That's the most you could give a runaway, you know. And then when he got through with that, he gave me one more gift. He gave me this. A metal collar. A neck ring, they call this. This is to show everyone I meet my shame and my crime, and to remind myself that I'm nothing but another man's property, like a chair or a shovel. And then they took me to the marketplace and had me sold. I stood there all day in that marketplace, with my eyes on the ground, watching the feet of the people passing by. And as I watched them go back and forth, I wondered who would buy me that day. But no one ever stopped to look at me. And sure, and I don't blame them. You see what I'm wearing? No one wanted to be settled with the like of that. It makes me a runaway, a convict, a criminal. What person wants that? And as I stood there and the day got later and later and later, I began to wonder what would happen to me if no one ever came to buy. And I think the jailman was worried about that too, because he began to call out a lower and lower voice and a lower and lower price. At last, long last, in front of me, I see the common clothes of a common man, and I hear a voice say, how much? And because the jailman was afraid he'd lose the only person that was interested that day, they struck a bargain. My papers were signed, and I was following my new master. A man that was dressed in a wagoner's clothes, a wagoner, you know, the one that carries things in a great wagon from place to place, from town to town, a delivery man. And as I followed him across that marketplace over to the wagon where he had it parked, I began to wonder that maybe because he was a common man, he might be a kinder man to me. But when we got over to that wagon, Don't you know, he reached into the back of it and took out a piece of rope and cut it. And he tied one end to my collar and the other end to the back of the wagon, and he said, "Now let's see you run away from me, missy." And he walked to the front and called out to the beast that were pulling the wagon, and off we moved. Me still wondering as I followed him through the market that maybe when we got to know each other a little better, he would prove to be a kinder man. But as I'm going through that marketplace, the young lads of the town, seeing me tied like I was, thought it was a great joke to pick up handfuls of filth and sporting like pick up rocks and throw them at me and watch me dodge the best I could. All the while tied, you see, to the back of that wagon. And what do you suppose that man said when he saw them doing that? Well, he threw back that great shaggy head he had, and he laughed a great laugh. Then he says, "Now be careful, boys, and don't harm the goods on the wagon." That's all the care he took of me. That's all the care he cared about me. And sure as I followed him the rest of the way through the town, I'm thinking to myself, "Oh, Maggie, sure and if the devil's got a brother, you've been sold to him. And in God's truth, I wasn't far wrong."
Now, Maggie.
Oh, I'm sorry, sir. I'm not
Now, Maggie,
saying...
I want you to tell her about him. She must understand that he is just such a man. Tell her. Tell it all.
Yes, sir. Well, this man was a cruel man, a harsh man, with a taste for strong drink and a temper to go with it. And he lived out alongside the river in a cabin with a shed out back for the beasts and a ring in the wall for me. 4 great oxen he had that pulled that wagon that he loved like children. He called them my boys, sons, and each and every one of them had a name and came like dogs when they were loose. He carried a great whip curled up in his hand. He cracked it over the top of their heads everywhere we go, but he never touched them with it, you see, because he's afraid they wouldn't love him enough to work for him anymore. But he never worried about that with me. My name was never more than Winch or Hussy or a few other names I'm too ashamed to tell you of. And every day, I feel the back of his hand across my face or that whip on my shoulders or legs if I displeased him in some way or if he just felt like doing it because I was his to do it with. This was a man now I had to serve, to fix his meals and stand by while he ate because he only gave me the scraps, to help him load and unload the wagon, to hook and unhook the beast, and always to do everything he said to do, no matter when or where or how he said to do it. And everywhere we went, I followed behind, tied by the neck to that wagon like a cur dog. Now, the only thing he loved more than those beasts was the drink. And there was many a day that I sat crouched beneath that wagon while he took his fill at a tavern or an alehouse. Now, if the prophets had been good that day, he'd just stay in there until he was satisfied. And when he'd come out, he'd only have curses for me. But if the prophets were bad, or the money not enough, or the credit not good, he'd come out far too early, and he'd just be looking for something to flay on. And guess what he had to do it with? And I'd have the marks and the bruises the next day to show for it. I knew I was going to die here. I knew that this was the place that I would lose my life. Because, see, I knew that he'd already killed the one that was there before me, and her but 19 years old. So what chance did I have? And what else could I do? I have nothing but rags to wear, no shoes on my feet, nothing to keep me warm, and the days are getting colder and colder and colder, and I'm getting weaker and weaker and weaker. But you know, I didn't care. I didn't care. Everything I had to live for was gone, and so if I died, so much the better for me. Well, there finally came a day. And it was so cold and so wet. And there I was crouched beneath the wagon outside an alehouse again while he took his fill. I was shivering and shaking so, and my teeth were rattling. I think if I'd put them together, my whole head would have rattled clear off. And my poor feet, they were cut and bruised from the ice I was breaking through in the road, so that I could hardly stand up and walk along behind him. Now the prophets had been bad that day. And he came out far too early. And when he did, he jerked me out from beneath that wagon, slapped me across my face and said, "Now keep up." And he walked to the front and took off with the oxen. me stumbling along behind, trying to keep up. And as I'm walking behind him in the growing darkness, stepping through the ice and the mud, sure I'm stumbling because my feet can't hardly hold me. And as I stumble forward, I catch myself on the back of the wagon because I knew if I ever went down, I'd never get up again. But at last I miss. And down I go face first in that mud, and I'm drugged by the neck until he can get the oxen stopped. And when he came back and found me on my hands and knees in the mud trying to get up again, all of that anger came out at me at once. And he hit me such a blow in the middle of my back with that whip that he put me right back down on the ground again, and the breath gone clean out of me, and there I lay. And when I didn't move fast enough for him, all of that anger came out at me at once. And he began to kick and to curse and to scream and beat at me as I lay there on the ground. And I knew he meant to kill me. But the strange thing is that the more that he beat on me, the more that life inside of me began to fade away. And as it did, I began to not feel the pain or the blows or the cold and the muck and mire of the road. I could hear it all, but it was like it was a great distance away, and it was moving further and further. And my mind went back to the days when I was with my Robbie. And I thought about the place that we were going to go get, the hope and the find that we were looking for, and all that we had done to get there, and now it had just come to this. And I felt such a great sadness. But before the darkness took me away, I heard another voice. And then I heard shouting. And I thought perhaps it was St. Peter that had come for me instead. And then I felt and heard no more. Now I thought I should have died. But when I opened my eyes again, I didn't see the pearly gates of heaven, but instead a fire, and next to it a figure all in black. And I thought, oh, Maggie, it wasn't St. Peter, but the devil himself who'd come for me instead. But the truth of it is this traveling minister had come by, and when he saw the wagoner beaten on something on the ground, he'd stopped to see what it was. And when he saw it was a woman, he'd shouted at him to stop. That's what I'd heard. But I didn't belong to him now, did I? And he had to buy me from the wagoner in order to save my life. I've been with him now for 2 years, traveling everywhere he goes. And he's a good man for a preacher, even though he's not Presbyterian. And he's a generous man, for didn't he buy me these fine clothes from a farmer whose servant had died and she didn't need them anymore? Of course, we don't know exactly what she died of. And I have shoes too, but I'm not allowed to wear them unless it snows. And he's a kindly man, for sure, and he's not lifted his hand to me one time the 2 years that we are together, although I know he's been sorely tempted to do so. But he can preach at you something awful. And there are some men God never meant to see.
Oh, Maggie.
I'm not saying, sir,
I
I'm just
know,
telling
you're
them
just
that.
telling her that.
But he's a poor man too, as you can tell by his clothes, and he's no need of a servant. And so he tries to sell me everywhere I go. So I never know what tomorrow will bring, or what new person I will go home with, or what new place I'll be sleeping at tonight. But it's all right. My heart's come back up off the ground. And although I'm not happy, I am more contented. But still, there's ever a night when I sit and look into the fire that doesn't my heart and my mind take me ringing back to Ireland. And suddenly I'm there again, sitting before my own peat fire in that little stone hut. My children are at my feet, and my baby in my arms. And I look, and sitting there next to me, with the firelight dancing off his face, is Robbie. And oh, his eyes are all a twinkling, and he's smiling that devil grin at me. And he's just almost ready to say my name. And it's so real that I feel like I can reach out and touch it. But when I do, it all disappears. And again, I'm still alone. Oh, Robbie. Oh, Marguerite. Why did you leave me here alone? Why didn't you take me with you?
Maggie. Maggie. Maggie.
Forgive me. I lost myself to you. 8 more years I have, till this collar comes off my neck. 8 more years till the papers that hold me bound to another man will be mine and I will be free. And on the day that that happens, I'll turn my feet westward, and it's to the land of the setting sun I'll go, because there the land is free. And a man and a woman can take that land and make a place and a home that no one can ever take away from them again. And I'll find me such a man that don't care what I was or where I'm from or the scars that are bare upon my neck, but be glad to have a woman like me to stand by his side. And I do that. Not for love. Not this time. I do that so that on the day that my eyes close in death and they lay me near between the sod of my own land, I'll be able to look up into Robbie's eyes. And I'm going to say to him, I did it, Robbie. I made it for the both of us. I have no more tale to tell you. And I'm done with it all.